The US government should open up. There is no reason not to.
Children have to be back in school. We cannot have this continuation of this hybrid or work from home situation anymore if we can avoid it.
We are continuing to engage with the Taliban in Doha. We are not blind to the suffering of the civilians.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Elon Musk touches down in Berlin. The CDU chancellor candidate visits the Tesla factory in Brandenburg this morning. We're live from Germany. Credit Suisse risk revamp while the Swiss lender rebuilds its risk management team in the wake of this year's heavy losses. And Afghanistan's rapidly advancing Taliban capture the second and third largest cities in the country overnight as they close in on the capital, Kabul. Later on in the show, we speak to an Afghan political commentator. So good morning, everyone. Today, actually, the markets are pretty thin on the ground in terms of volumes. We do have a couple of data points in the U.S. that we need to bring you up to date with. Overall, though, European stocks are actually boosted by cyclicals. French equities nearing a record as economic reopenings boosted cyclical stocks that I was just mentioning, but also luxury firms. If you look at Asian stocks, they're definitely continuing to struggle as vaccinations lag and the Delta variant hampers some of those reopenings. Now on to our one of our top stories, and Tesla chief executive Elon Musk has touched down in Berlin. This morning, the CSU chancellor candidate Armin Laschet will visit Tesla's unfinished car and battery factory. Now, transforming Germany's auto industry is a key concern for September's national election as Europe's biggest economy tries to modernize one of its key sectors. Well, let's get more now with our Maria Tadeo, who's actually outside the Tesla factory. So first of all, Maria, for Germany, what's the significance of Elon Musk's visit today?
Yes, Francine, there's actually a read across here. This is about the company, it's about Germany, but it's also about the political campaign heading into the election. As you say, Elon Musk will be on this site. You see it behind me. This is a site that Tesla says will be a very high volume for electric cars and will be a key part of their plan to expand. But you also know, Francine, that there has been a number of delays here. The inauguration date on this, it's unclear. Elon Musk has been very vocal about the fact that he believes the German bureaucracy is not helping to accelerate the production here. So he will want to have a conversation around that. And then the other, of course, is for Armin Laschet himself, the CDU chancellor candidate. We have seen him slipping in polls consistently now for 3 weeks. He's not been able to really recover from the management of the floodings. And he wants to come out here to say, I'm out with the big CEOs. We want to talk business. I can take the country forward and kind of just cling on to the star power from Elon Musk. I can guarantee you this will be on every news show in Germany today, whether that works, whether that takes Armin Laschet bigger in polls and gives his campaign momentum really remains to be seen. But he's hoping that is the direction of travel after this meeting.
Maria, you're talking about this fairy dust that, of course, Armin Laschet hopes to have when close to Elon Musk. At the same time, if Tesla is a big threat to the German auto industry, could it actually backfire?
Yeah, it actually is. And, Francine, for the German cars, of course, have said that they want to compete also in the electric side. They will have to just purely based on the regulation. You know that the European Commission has been very clear by 2035, all combustion cars need to be taken off the road. What they argue, however, is that Tesla is not really a competitor to the made in Germany industry. They say that this is still a niche model. The price point is also not ideal for the middle average German, and that Germans ultimately want to buy made in Germany. This is an industry that they feel proud of. So the competition is who gets first in terms of this affordable electric vehicle. But it could backfire to some extent on Laschet's campaign if he's seen as perhaps being too cozy with the Americans, perhaps too cozy with Tesla, and not doing enough to defend what is the backbone of the German industry, of course, the car makers.
Yeah, always difficult being a politician in these kind of photo ops, especially if you're not doing too great in the polls. Maria, thank you so much. Our Maria Tadeo there in Berlin for us. Now to a top corporate story, and Credit Suisse is revamping its risk management team as part of the fallout of the around $5.5 billion hit it saw from the Archegos scandal. With the details, we're joined by Bloomberg's finance reporter in Zurich, Marion Halftermeyer, who of course helped write the story. Marion, 2 new board members. What does this actually tell us about the revamp of risk management we could further see?
Hi, Francine. Yes, so, we're seeing Chairman Antonio Horta-Osorio really making headway on his promise, the promise he made back in April when he became chairman of the board of Credit Suisse, to really look at in-depthly what risk management looked like at Credit Suisse and to revamp it. So we've been seeing regular announcements of people both being booted and being replaced by rival candidates, coming with very strong records from other banks. So most recently this morning, we have Axel Lehmann, who was a chief risk officer for Zurich Insurance for a very long time before taking on running the UBS's Swiss business. And then you also have Juan Columbus, who is the former risk chief officer of Lloyd's, where the chairman himself used to be the CEO. So we're looking at an ally there. But also, the bank announced a couple of weeks ago that they're creating 20 new risk positions. So we're seeing that action being taken.
Yeah, so Credit Suisse, Marion, also hired a new chief risk officer from Goldman Sachs. It's replacing the head of its risk, committee. I guess, how much more does he need to go? So if you look at the chairman, and you explained it beautifully, he's doing what he promised. Will it be enough to convince shareholders and to get the bank on a better footing?
That is the million-dollar question. So there's still another position to fill. The compliance officer, the chief compliance officer, is still an ad interim at the moment, so he still needs to fill that position. And then after, Credit Suisse is still at a real risk of potential litigation from its clients over the Greensill matter. There still might be some regulatory outcome from the Archegos matter. You'll be sure that the regulators are going to look at that 160-plus page report about how badly they screwed up. So they're not out of the water yet. They're not out of their situation just yet. And going forward, we're still looking for a strategic update from the chairman.
Marion, thank you so much. Bloomberg's finance reporter there in Zurich on Credit Suisse, Marion Halftermeyer. Now, coming up, dollar gains continue amid tapering bets. We'll get into the markets and how virus risk could impact FX. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, U.S. futures holding steady after yet another record close for the S&P 500 yesterday. Meanwhile, the dollar is on track for its second weekly gain. It's got a boost from hawkish comments from Fed officials around the timeline for tapering. We're joined now by Esther Reichelt, the FX strategist at Commerzbank. Esther, thank you for joining us on Bloomberg Surveillance. When you look at some of the expectations on inflation, it's very clear that the market is kind of believing that, like the Fed has been saying, that it's transitory. How will that play out in dollar dynamics?
Yeah, that's exactly the interesting question, because, of course, as higher inflation currently goes, the more the market is going to expect that we are going to see possibly more aggressive rate hikes, which is, of course, US dollar positive. But the question is whether the US dollar can actually keep this dynamic or carry on with this dynamic if inflation actually starts falling towards the end of the year.
So what's your target, Esther, on euro dollar?
We actually believe that the market is going to be disappointed towards the end of the year, and in particular next year, as inflation is going to fall considerably. And if inflation falls back to the Fed's target by itself, of course, the expectations will be very limited that the Fed is going to hike aggressively. So what we expect in Fed rate hikes is more in line with what the market is actually already pricing in. So like further appreciation potential of the US dollar will be limited, and there might even be the need for some downside correction in euro dollar. So we actually expect that euro dollar might actually rise back to above the 120 next year.
Esther, overall, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, for example, what's happening in Asia, which is that there's a COVID resurgence and it could change the path from certain central banks about what they want to do. Does that change your view on any of their currencies?
No, not necessarily, because we have expected this risk, or it's already priced into our forecast. In particular, you can see this very well for the Australian dollar. You know, like the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, is sticking to a very flexible approach. You know, like they are not committing to any long-term forward guidance, but are saying like, okay, we are waiting now and see how the Delta wave plays out. And this is, of course, some risk for the currency, because nobody knows where it's actually going, and nobody knows whether this will mean that the central banks will start tightening earlier or even later. So also traders in the market have to have to be very flexible over the next few months.
Esther, I like that you picked out actually two emerging market currencies that we don't talk about very often. That's a Polish zloty and then Turkish lira. But let's start with Turkish lira. What exactly are you expecting the central bank there to do?
Yeah, the central bank of Turkey is under immense pressure from politics. Erdogan is always asking quite explicitly for them to lower interest rates because he expects this to play out in lower inflation. However, this is, of course, not the conventional view, and the central bank can expect that we would see a strong Turkish lira sell-off if they actually start cutting the interest rate quite soon, because the inflation dynamics are still quite strong. We even expect a CPI inflation of 20% towards the end of the year. And with the current interest rate of 19%, of course, rate cutting potential is very limited. It's not existent. So, the question is whether who will dominate. And we actually fear that if the central bank does not commit to cutting interest rates, quite soon politics could again try to intervene directly into central bank affairs.
But Esther, how much appetite for risk do you need to actually get into Turkish markets right now, given also the removal of previous central bank deputies?
Well, you have to be very very interested in taking risk, because we think actually we are coming closer to an end game. And currently, also looking back at over the developments over the past few years, we do not see a way how this could end up positive for the Turkish lira.
Esther, what's your take on Polish zloty? I mean, there's a controversial legislation that could, that's really at the forefront of everyone's mind. Does that translate into the currency?
Yeah, there's definitely the risk. I mean, this is another example where politics now might come into a stronger, important, or might be more important for the currency going forward. However, here it's still uncertain how this will actually play out exactly. However, right now, the fear is that the now remaining minority government will actually move further to the far right, further to the EU critical voices in Poland. And this can't be positive for Poland and the Polish zloty going forward, as Poland is a net recipient of EU funds. And it's something quite important for the Polish growth outlook as well. So without this, the outlook for Poland and the Polish zloty is severely dampened.
So, Esther, do you have a target actually for euro zloty, or how do you play zloty?
We actually expect a euro zloty to move up going forward, also because the Polish central bank seems to stick to its dovish stance. Inflation is still quite high, so the upside for Polish zloty is simply limited if we don't see any surprising developments.
Esther, what's your take on euro? So euro is another interesting one, especially when it comes to central banks, just because of all the various dynamics that the president of the ECB has to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. However, interestingly, we do not believe that the monetary policy for the euro is that important for the euro, because everybody knows that the ECB is going to stick to its extremely dovish stance. And, this won't change whether we'll see a percentage point, 0.2 percentage points higher inflation or not, or something like that. They are not going to tighten their monetary policy for the next few years. And hence, the impact on the euro is extremely limited.
Esther, thanks so much. Esther Reichelt there from Commerzbank staying with us. Now, Afghanistan's rapidly advancing Taliban capture the second and third largest cities in the country overnight as they close in on the capital, Kabul. Later in the program, we speak to the Afghan political commentator Shabnam Nasimi. This is Bloomberg.
This is not a kinder and gentler Taliban. Remember, they chose the wilderness rather than hand over al-Qaeda. We gave them that ultimatum after 9/11. Give up al-Qaeda and we'll leave you alone. They wouldn't do that. They are now vindicated. And all Americans should be, frankly, quite concerned that as the Taliban moves back in, al-Qaeda is going to be right there with them.
It's clear that President Biden has made up his mind. He's not changing his mind by all appearances. At the same time, if we had left in, what was it, something like 2,500 of our troops, would that have made the difference? Could that have stopped the Taliban? It seems like too few.
Yeah, that's the irony of all of this, David. When I was ambassador, we had almost 100,000 troops. We got down to 2,500, 3,500, and still the Taliban had not been able to occupy a single provincial capital, and there were 34 of them. So it wasn't so much our firepower, although that certainly was a factor. It was the backbone we gave to Afghan forces. They now perceive, rightly, that we've just hung them out to dry, that we did a deal with their enemy, and now we expect them to fight to the last soldier against that enemy. Not going to happen.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan there, Ryan Crocker, speaking to Bloomberg. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. The U.S. has cleared third jabs for some immunocompromised individuals. Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna COVID vaccines can now be used, but the FDA says other fully vaccinated individuals do not yet need a third dose. Meanwhile, a U.S. Supreme Court judge has rejected a challenge to Indiana University's requirement that all students be vaccinated against COVID for the coming semester. The case marks the first time the nation's highest court has acted on a vaccine mandate. Now, police in Plymouth in southwest England have confirmed 6 people, including a suspected gunman, have died in a firearms incident. 3 females, 2 males, and the suspect died. No motive has yet been reported. Murders committed with firearms average about 30 per year here in the UK, which has some of the world's strictest gun control laws. Donald Trump's fundraising committee has hired 2 political workers familiar with campaigns in Iowa, the state that typically kicks off the race for the White House. Trump has been hinting about another presidential run, though he has so far steered clear of activities that would trigger federal election laws requiring him to register as a candidate, limiting spending. And UK wages are rising as companies scramble to hire enough staff to help them recover in the post-lockdown period. According to the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, a near record number of online job advertisements were posted last week. The British economy grew faster than expected in June, putting more pressure on employers to hire. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Let's go back to pound. Now, we've seen a bit of movement on pound this week. We're joined back by Esther Reichelt, FX strategist at Commerzbank. Esther, I wish we had a pound chart. We may have a pound chart. It may come up momentarily. But if you look at it, we got a little bit of a boost after we got growth that was maybe better than expected for most economists. But now it's drifting sideways, as the real question is, how durable is this growth?
Yes, exactly. That's an interesting question because the UK has now opened up. All restrictions are lifted. And the interesting question is now, how will the normalization play out? And the big fear there is that now actually another risk could come back into the forefront. And that's the question how Brexit is actually going to impact the economy long term. Because it's not only about a question about trade, but also a question about how the nowadays more limited movement of workers, of tourists will impact the UK economy.
So what's your take on where, sterling goes from here? And actually, do you look at euro sterling or something, more, I guess, advanced like sterling yen?
No, we are largely still looking at euro sterling, although this might actually change due to the Brexit going forward. However, we think that a lot of the positive news is already priced into pound sterling. For further upside in sterling, so further appreciation potential for sterling, we would need to see quite clear signals by the Bank of England that they are going to moving towards rate hikes, and we still expect this to be quite unlikely, at least over the next few months, due to the still substantial risks regarding the normalization of the economy.
Esther, thank you so much. Esther Reichelt there from Commerzbank with us there to talk about currencies. Now, Afghanistan's rapidly advancing Taliban capture the second and third largest cities in the country overnight as they close in on the capital, Kabul. Up next, we speak to an Afghan political commentator, Shabnam Nasimi. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg. Elon Musk touches down in Berlin. The CDU chancellor candidate visits a Tesla factory in Brandenburg this morning. A COVID outbreak in China partially shuts down one of the world's busiest container ports. The port of Los Angeles anticipates disruptions from China's move. And Afghanistan's rapidly advancing Taliban capture the second and third largest cities in the country overnight as they close in on the capital, Kabul. Up next, we speak to Afghan political commentator Shabnam Nasimi. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, first of all, let's check on the markets. Again, volumes are quite short or quite thin, simply because it's August. It feels like August. A lot of people at the beach. It's the U.S. 10-year yield that's grabbing our attention at 134.21 after all of the economic data that we had this week. If you look at the S&P futures, they're pretty much unchanged. It's really a tale also of two cities or two parts of the world, I would say. On the one hand, you have Asia with further lockdowns, worried also about what we heard from China and that regulatory crackdown. Here in Europe, the CAC 40 in France poised to hit the highest in more than 2 decades as retailers are leading the gains in European stocks. Now, Afghan officials say that the rapidly advancing Taliban have captured 2 more major cities. The seizure of Kandahar and Herat marks the biggest prizes yet for the insurgents, who have taken 12 of Afghanistan's 34 provincial capitals as part of a week-long push to capture the Central Asian nation. As talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban are ongoing in Doha, the UN is hopeful for a peaceful solution.
We are continuing to believe that there is a political solution that can be had. This doesn't mean that we are also blind to what is going on on the ground. We are not blind to the suffering of the civilians who are caught in crossfire in urban environments.
Well, as we heard earlier, the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Ryan Crocker, told Bloomberg that the U.S., with its troop withdrawal, has essentially handed the country over to the Taliban. We're now joined by British Afghan political commentator Shabnam Nasimi. She's the executive director of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. In 1999, Shabnam's family fled her native Afghanistan, escaping the Taliban, and settled in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us, Shabnam. First of all, how much is the U.S. to blame for this, because they withdrew after 20 years in the country?
Thank you for having me on, Francine. This is definitely not our finest hour. I guess what comes to mind is what happened to either global Britain or America is back. It's a deadly and dangerous situation for the people of Afghanistan, and this is a huge strategic error and a human tragedy in the making. The growing conflict in Afghanistan has been caused by President Biden's reckless decision to withdraw US troops so suddenly and irresponsibly. And to just give you a perspective, 5,000 civilians have been killed in the most recent fighting. We know that 30,000 people a week are fleeing the country, and we know that around 1 million people have been displaced in the last 3 months. fleeing from areas under Taliban control. Camps are overcrowded, children sleeping in the open, families are fighting over food. We fear that the situation is being replicated across the country at an unprecedented pace. That sense of abandonment is definitely real.
Do you think the U.S. left thinking that the Afghani troops could actually handle this? And is there anything that the international community can now do to try and bolster the troops?
Well, look, I think we fail to understand that what happens in Afghanistan is a regional crisis, not just an Afghanistan crisis. It needs to be dealt at a regional level. And I'm sure you agree that from past history and sort of the track record, we've seen that anything that happens in Afghanistan directly impacts security in the West, and particularly the US. And it's one of the reasons why the US went to Afghanistan in the first place. At the time the decision was made, there were 10,000, I think, NATO troops stationed in the country. 2,500 of them were American and fewer than 1,000 British. These are very small numbers. The UK has more soldiers in operation in places like Cyprus, and the US has more soldiers guarding its own capital. The decision to leave raises a lot of questions. First of all, what is NATO if it's not able to work through such problems? It ought to have been possible for the NATO and other allies that when the US decided to withdraw, for them to sort of step in and take over sort of the slack, considering that, a small number of US troops actually were stationed there in a non-combat role. So it's totally shameful for NATO in this present moment, because this was a massive coalition, and people are forgetting that the Turks, I think, have very courageously remained in Afghanistan whilst everyone else is leaving. This is definitely an abandonment.
So,
what's important? Yeah, sorry.
So what's the solution? Actually, what is the way forward from now? If this is an abandonment, is it now too little too late? Or is there anything that the international community do to try and support Afghanistan at the moment?
Well, unless we wake up to the reality of what has taken place, Afghanistan might once again become a terror state. The mission was never going to be simple. It is a deeply fragmented, corrupt, sort of paralyzed by decades of conflict sort of nation. But I think what we need to now, the questions that we need to raise now is whether this withdrawal is simply military, or it's going to be matched by humanitarian, diplomatic and political withdrawal as well. What I hope to see is that the withdrawal is done now. I want to make sure that the people are not forgotten. This is definitely going to be a human tragedy in the making. And if we don't step in now to avoid a humanitarian disaster, it will affect the region and it will come back to bite us in a few years to come.
So, Shabnam, you're talking about civilian casualties and about refugees.
Absolutely. Civilian casualties in Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan. I am constantly being contacted by Afghans on the ground, women specifically, begging me to help them to get out. And this is the desperation that I'm talking about. People need support right now, food, humanitarian assistance, anything that will help them find a home, find shelter, and be able to survive. Because if we not only leave militarily, but we leave in terms of also humanitarian assistance, political support, diplomatic support, this will become a human tragedy for sure.
Shabnam, is there any hope that the Taliban will actually seek some kind of political compromise?
Well, the people of Afghanistan did definitely at the beginning, in the last couple of years, even the start of this year, had a lot of hope that there will be some sort of settlement. This is what they've been looking forward to. This is why the negotiations are taking place. Unfortunately, though, what the Taliban say in Doha and what they actually put in practice in Afghanistan are completely two different stories. In Doha, they tell us that they've changed, whereas in Afghanistan, they're still attacking civilians, killing a young girl in Mazar-e-Sharif just a week or so ago for not wearing proper clothes or being outside on our own. So the reality is very different. They clearly have not changed. Afghanistan has, on the other hand, changed. In the last 20 years, the people of Afghanistan have tasted freedom, and it's not something they're willing to give up.
Shabnam, why are the Afghani troops so ill-prepared for this?
Well, unfortunately, I think we made a mistake in believing that in the last 20 years, we've created a nation that is resilient, that can survive on its own. Even the West and the US and Europe were not created and developed into societies that we live in today, free societies, in 20 years. It took hundreds of years to get where we are. Afghanistan had just started to get to a point where institutions were being embedded, infrastructure was being built, and it was at the point where if we had remained and supported them for a few more years, potentially they would have been able to survive and build their own nation on their own. But we left irresponsibly without taking notice of the fact that the armed forces were not equipped. They did not have the right training to deal with this on their own. Many of them have surrendered in areas that the Taliban are capturing because they don't think they have the morale and the support to fight on. And unfortunately, it's a reality we should have expected. We clearly had a misjudgment. And when I say we, I mean Britain, Europe, and the US in this case. And it's something that we're going to have to really look more closely at in terms of what went wrong. Because if we assume that just because what's happening in Afghanistan is not going to impact us now, that it won't impact us in the next couple of years, we're very naive to assume that this is the end of the story.
Shabnam, thank you so much. Shabnam Nasimi there, Executive Director of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, joining us with some very important perspective this morning. Now, we're also getting some breaking news out of UEFA. We understand through our Bloomberg scoop that UEFA is closing in on a $7 billion package to heal European football. Now, what we understand is that it's actually putting the final touches on a rescue package valued at as much as $7 billion to help European football recover from the impact of the pandemic. This is according to people familiar with the matter. So basically, the plans could be announced as soon as this month. And the football body is also set to propose new rules, for example, on player wages. Under the proposals, clubs will have access to funds at lower borrowing costs and will also be able to restructure existing debt over long periods of 5 to 7 years. So it does seem like it's a pretty comprehensive, also money deal. Coming up, a Delta outbreak partially shuts down one of the world's busiest ports. More on the fallout and what it could mean for global trade next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash with Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Philip Morris has moved closer to the acquisition of Victoria Group, a maker of asthma drugs, after the company's board backed the tobacco giant's £1 billion offer. Victoria says the offer by Philip Morris is fair and reasonable, supporting it over a lower one from PE group Carlyle. More than 20 scientific groups and health charities have urged Victoria to reconsider for ethical and practical reasons. Now, Disney has delighted investors with a better than expected set of results for the quarterly results. A surge in streaming customers. Disney Plus grew to 116 million subscribers, and the company's parks, experiences and products business pulled in $4.3 billion, both metrics beating estimates. Earnings at the world's largest entertainment company rose to 80 cents a share, excluding some items, smashing the 55 cents estimate. Now, Airbnb shares fell during late trading after it forecast a decline in quarterly bookings compared with pre-pandemic levels. The company blamed the spread of the Delta variant of COVID-19 for the gloomy outlook, but it did beat Wall Street's expectations for second quarter revenues, which came in 37% up on 2019's levels. And private equity firm Hellman & Friedman has offered to buy pet supplies retailer Zooplus for €390 per share in cash. The bid, which is backed by Zooplus's management, values the German company at about €2.8 billion. Zooplus has been among the big winners of pandemic lockdowns as people stuck at home brought pets. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine, I know you got a little doggy in the lockdown.
I know. I feel like I'm now an expert actually on Zooplus. I could advise private equity companies on what they should buy, Leanne, because if you look at the amount of money spent on organic food, I mean, I've had my puppy for like 3 months. I mean, and dog walkers, this is like a proper business.
I always say my dog walkers could buy a house on all the money I've spent on them over the years that I've had my two little dogs. But Francine, as we were saying, it just brings so much happiness despite the cash we have to pay out.
Yeah, so much love. But if you want an investment, for what it's worth, get into pet servicing or whatever you want to call it, and maybe warehouses, because we buy so many packages. Leanne, thank you so much for all of that. Now, China has partially shut the world's third busiest container port after a worker became infected with COVID. It's threatening more damage to a fragile global supply chain. It also comes as freight costs have already been rising. Let's get more now from Bloomberg's China economy editor, James Maker. James, thank you so much for joining us. How much do we actually know about the shutdown?
Good morning, Francine. So what we know so far is that the one port worker was found to have asymptomatic coronavirus a couple of days ago during regular testing. So he'd already been vaccinated with Sinovac in January and March, and then they're already isolating the port workers to keep them out of risk of getting infected. And then during regular testing, he was found to be positive, and it seems he caught it from a sailor on one of the ships in the port. So they've isolated him and about 10 of his closest co-workers, and they're basically keeping them under observation. And the hope is that they've managed to catch it early before other people in the port and families, etc., have been infected.
Yeah, so James, I find this fascinating. We don't know how long it could last, but what's amazing, it basically impacts all ports around the world. You know, for example, Los Angeles, that's very dependent on that trade.
That's right. I mean, when you look at the case numbers in the U.S. or in Europe or other places, I mean, one case, it seems such an overreaction, but here in China, this is the government zero COVID policy. It means literally that, zero COVID. Xi Jinping came out a few days ago with a message that was sent across the nation to every local authority saying, zero COVID means zero COVID. There must be no cases. And this is what they do when there is one case in a port. They shut that port down. When there is a case in a city, they shut the city down and test millions of people. And so while this is going to disrupt exports, while this is going to disrupt imports in the U.S., it's going to disrupt imports in Europe, this is what the Chinese do, and this is how they're going to continue to do it as long as there are cases that occur. So we can expect more of these kind of things.
So, James, how difficult is it to actually try and, it's a timeline thing, right? So if it stays closed a week, it's different than if it stays closed like 3 weeks. But is there, a way to minimize the impact? If you do it, I guess, often, but for 1 or 2 days, is it less disruptive? Do we have any idea of calculating the economic effect of these closures?
I mean, the earlier port shutdown that happened late May and into June in Shenzhen, I mean, that continued for a month, and the damage to that was quite substantial. The port was backed up. There were hundreds of thousands of containers that didn't get shipped out that month, and that's partly because that went on for a whole month. I guess the hope here is that they've isolated the case very quickly. It was only a couple of days apparently between tests when he may have been contagious, and so hopefully, if there are no more cases, they can restart very quickly. But obviously, even a week shutdown is going to have an effect on the logistics across the Pacific. And so, even a small shutdown, hopefully, if it's just a week or so, it's still going to have an effect, but hopefully that'll be much smaller than a month.
James, thank you so much. Bloomberg's China economy editor there, James Mager. Now, coming up, a bumper earnings season, we look into the solid performance of most European cyclicals with our senior strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, Tim Craighead. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, as earnings season winds down, cyclical stocks have consistently beaten estimates in Europe. But will that continue in the second half when uncertainty about the pandemic actually persists? Well, for more, Tim Craighead, senior European strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence, joins us. Tim, so how do you assess your mid-year earnings overall? I imagine it's pretty good.
Indeed, Francine. I think if you couch the earnings season in a word, it would be exceptional. About 2/3 of the companies have beat expectation. Only a quarter have missed. This never happens in Europe, where things tend to be more half-half on beats and misses. If you look at the numbers that have been generated, expectations going into the quarter were for growth at about 130%. As we've concluded earnings, we've actually seen about 180% growth. Now, granted, that's off of an easy compare from last year, but the numbers speak, for themselves. And as you pointed out, cyclicals have been leading. Energy, metals and mining, autos, banks. In banks, it's not only been a releasing of reserves, we've actually started to see revenue growth. And I would say that the one area that's been disappointing have been the consumer staples companies. There we saw misses, and we saw growth expectations of 8% early fade to basically no earnings growth at all in the quarter. So that has been a sticking point.
Yeah, Tim, guidance, particularly important this earnings season. So what have you been hearing about costs and margins?
Yeah, the setup was definitely for the idea that we need positive guidance. In general, even with the worries on costs, on supply, the majority of companies have actually given positive guidance who have talked about the forward outlook. The stocks have traded up that did get that forward guidance. Expectations for next year's earnings advanced a few percent. And again, that's about 2/3 of the companies. But the 1/3 that missed were punished. Expectations down, et cetera. And again, a lot of that tends to be more on the consumer-facing companies where they don't have the economic leverage to be raising prices quickly.
Tim, what about Beijing's crackdown on a number of industries? I mean, so we have earnings at mid-year season, and at the same time, China's kind of dominating and actually also weighing on European sentiment at the margins.
In ways, Francine, I'm a bit more concerned about China than I am the inflation issue. You'll recall that back in 2012, we had an anti-corruption campaign that spread to more of an anti-extravagance campaign that had broad ramifications. We're not anticipating that this time. First, it was tech, then it was education. We do think that we'll see further spreading to things like property, and healthcare that are important for the mainstream Chinese consumer. But most European companies are feeding into local growth, selling into China with partners. That tends to be a positive view at this point. And so we're worried, we're cautious, but we don't expect something untoward.
In 20 seconds, Tim, where are we on valuations?
Overall market, 16.5 times. The FTSE still stands out as extraordinarily cheap at 12.7, but we put out a note today, actually, cautioning against carrying that too far, because even in FTSE, the median stock is trading at 17 times. So, there's not a lot of value per se. It's all about earnings growth going forward. We continue to be positively disposed for that.
Interesting. What a great roundup. Thank you so much. Tim Craighead there, Senior European Strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller joins me out of Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. We have a couple of fun stories. First of all, we need to talk about football with that UEFA scoop that they would do a package of about $7 billion that would also give them power to refinance and maybe look at wages of some of the clubs. And then the other story, of course, is what's happening with, Credit Suisse we'll also look at Philip Morris. That bid, actually, for them to get Vectura seems to be closer to getting through. So we'll have a look at that. Overall, the markets pretty much changing sideways, but actually European stocks definitely boosted by cyclicals. This is Bloomberg.
The US government should open up. There is no reason not to.
Children have to be back in school. We cannot have this continuation of this hybrid or work from home situation anymore if we can avoid it.
I think we're on the right direction. I think that in general, not only with the cinema business, the world is somehow learning to live with COVID and not to run away from COVID.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition with Francine Lacqua, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It's 10 a.m. in London, 11 a.m. in Berlin, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong on this Friday, August 13th. Our top stories today. It's Disney's World. Its entertainment giant flagship streaming service is attracting more customers than expected, and theme park reservations have picked up. Looking to jumpstart his campaign in Germany, Angela Merkel's would-be successor hopes that a meeting with Tesla chief executive Elon Musk will help him with forward-thinking voters. And the cigarette maker that wants to help people with asthma, why Philip Morris is on the verge of buying drug maker Vectura. Well, there's quite a lot going on in the markets. I mean, that story, Kailey, we'll talk a lot more about because it's not intuitive that actually it's a tobacco company buying an asthma company. In the markets, it's very clear that Asia is struggling a bit because of that regulatory concern coming from Beijing.
Yeah, and not only that, Francine, in the Asian region, they're really struggling with the COVID-19 outbreak. So there's a number of risks there, and that really showed up in the Asian session, which was broadly lower. We were looking at stocks down in Japan, in South Korea, in Hong Kong, and China. A lot of red on the screen when you look at Map Markets Go or WM Go on the Bloomberg terminal. Of course, on the regulatory front in China, you now have legislators looking to crack down on personal data collection in apps. So that dragged on the Hang Seng Tech Index. It was down about 2%. And of course, your big underperformance in the region came again from Korea. Really, chip stocks in the electronics sector were the biggest drags there. The electronics sector down about 3% in the South Korean session. And the biggest drag within that index was Samsung, off by more than 3 percentage points today, but actually had its worst week since all the way back in March of 2020 at the height of the COVID pandemic. And speaking of South Korea and the underperformance there, I'm going to sound like a broken record because the South Korean won, I'm going to talk about again, 5th day of weakness in a row, weaker against the dollar. By about 0.5%. It's the biggest underperformer in Asia, and it actually is at its weakest since September of last year. As for the picture here in the U.S., very different, much more upbeat. We had our 47th record high of the year for the S&P 500 yesterday. Can we make it 48 today is the question. Right now, futures are in positive territory, up about 0.1% on S&P E-minis. In the bond market, we are seeing yields coming down about 2 basis points on the 10-year Treasury, 1.34%. That is still higher than where we started the week, though, so we could be looking at the second consecutive weekly advance for Treasury yields, the first time that has happened since March. Crude is lower, however. It's had a very volatile week. Could maybe still eke out a weekly gain, but obviously the supply and demand picture is being weighed right now. WTI sitting at $68.65 a barrel. And then just have to note Bitcoin also had a volatile week, a little bit of a down day yesterday, Matt, but back up the better part of 4% this morning. We are back north of $46,000.
All right, so Bitcoin continues really to rally. Let's take a look at what's going on. In terms of, Kailey, you were mentioning consecutive records hit. We've got that in Europe as well. I don't know why you'd type map space markets go when you could just type WM go. It seems like a no-brainer to me. They both work, but one is 2 letters and so much more efficient. In any case, if you look at this, you can see green across the screen. For the most part, there's a little bit of gray there, but the Stock 600, which is the broader European index, is up for 10 days in a row. That's the longest streak of, well, new records 10 days in a row, I should say. The longest streak of records we've seen since 1999. Where did you celebrate New Year's 1999? That was a big one for me. Take a look at the CAC Caron. We're looking at... Do you remember? All right, we'll talk about that in a second. CAC Caron almost at a record as well. Well, that is fitting then to talk about the CAC here. We're looking at the strongest gain or the highest level on the CAC in at least 2 decades. And then in terms of individual stocks, there's so many to pick from. Stock stories here in Europe, but Adidas is one of my favorites. They're selling Reebok for $2.5 billion. So I think they're getting a pretty decent price for this asset to a company that buys, you know, bankrupt or failed brands. They bought my beloved Brooks Brothers as well. Did I get this tie? Maybe from Brooks Brothers. So I think it's really an interesting story and just one of the many, including Philip Morris and Victoria, as you were talking about, Francine. Always interesting to see, you know, when you make a product that causes a problem, then you can buy a product that fixes the problem. I think it's great. Thank you for the tie compliment.
The tie.
It's a little bright. I know it's a little bright. It's Friday.
It's a little bright, but you know what? It's summer, it's August. Most people are actually on a holiday. And Matt, I was going to ask you whether it's because you started drinking coffee. There you go. Maybe you change your everything
it's my
you're wearing
first week.
because you're now a coffee drinker. Welcome to the club.
My first week. Thank you.
When you look at the CAC 40, it's interesting to see that as soon as actually lockdown stopped in France, it's really the luxury products that kind of flew off the shelf.
Yeah, everyone wants, I guess, to buy those luxury products, and since they have the savings all stored up after a year and a half of not spending, they have the ability to do that. That's why those luxury companies, especially because the luxury companies also are listed in France. It's not just that French people are buying luxury products. Everyone is doing that, but Kering, Moet Hennessy, they're all listed in France, and that's what's driving the CAC.
Yeah, they have like the biggest conglomerates of luxury in the world. Now look at what else is ahead today. The University of Michigan releases its consumer sentiment index at 10 a.m. New York time. Then at 1 p.m. we'll get the Baker Hughes U.S. rig count. It's a quieter day for earnings. We'll get results today from Marathon Digital and 23andMe. That's the data company. Now Disney delighted investors with a better than expected set of quarterly results and a surge in streaming customers. Matt Bloxham, Bloomberg intelligence analyst, joins us now for the very latest. Matt, it does seem like they actually beat on all fronts.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, it was a very good quarter for them, I'd say, particularly on the streaming growth, given we'd had a weak print from Netflix a few weeks back, adding 12 million new customers to the Disney Plus service, and now the 116 million worldwide, was a good beat. And they were very optimistic about, the kind of runway for that business. They talked about an addressable market of 1.1 billion homes. So still potentially a lot of people to sell into. And they were very clear that the streaming service is their number one priority as a business going forward.
Well, Matt, it seems that the parks business is doing well. Obviously, they have streaming. Does this mean Disney doesn't have any weak spots, even with the Delta variant rearing its head in the U.S.?
It certainly seemed that way. Obviously, the parks business is still, below where it used to run. It generated just over $4 billion of revenue this quarter. Historically, it'd be more in the kind of 6 to 8 billion range. So there's a way to go back. But, I think what this shows is that as the world returns to normal, Disney is still an incredibly strong brand, and people want to be consuming their products, whether it's parks or content in the movie cinemas or on a streaming platform.
All right, Matt, thanks very much for joining us. Matt Bloxham from Bloomberg Intelligence talking to us about a story you're going to hear a lot about today, and watch that Disney stock as well. Also going to hear a lot about Tesla. The CEO, Elon Musk, is here in Berlin. This morning, the CDU-CSU Chancellor candidate, Armin Laschet, is visiting Tesla's unfinished car and battery factory. I think it's about 40 kilometers to the east of here. Transforming Germany's auto industry is a key concern for September's national election, as Europe's biggest economy tries to modernize one of its key sectors. Obviously, Germany known for its cars. Let's get more with Maria Tadeo, who is outside the Tesla factory. It's basically in a forest to the east of Berlin. So, Maria, what's the significance of Musk's visit today?
Yeah, so we're in the forest, quite literally, in the outskirts of Berlin. It's about, you're right, an hour away from the center of Berlin, and we are expecting Elon Musk to be here to visit this site. You see behind me, still very much under construction. Remember, Tesla says this will become one of the most advanced high-volume sites to make electric vehicles, but also batteries. Matt, there's many ways to look at the story. Of course, it's the corporate side of this. Elon Musk wants to see and check the construction of this site. We know there has been a number of delays here in the Berlin construction. He has blamed the German bureaucracy for it, saying it could be faster than the pace is going. The inauguration date for the site is still very much unclear. It's a big question mark, so I'm sure he will want to speak with Armin Laschet about this. But of course, there's the politics. And Matt, usually it's the CEO that wants a picture with the politician, but in this case, you could argue is the opposite. It really is Armin Laschet hoping to cling on to the star power there, to say, well, I'm with Elon Musk, we want to talk business, invest in Germany, and hope to revive the campaign of the CDU, which, as you know, has been slipping in polls now consistently every week for about a month now.
And Maria, this is quite unusual, right? As you say, like Armin Laschet going after the kind of the fairy stardust of Elon Musk could, I imagine, also backfire because Tesla presumably is a big threat to the German auto industry.
Yes, and Francine, it goes two ways. On the one hand, Armin Laschet has been criticized for almost representing the old Germany that's not forward-looking into the future. With this meeting, he wants to say, I'm actually speaking with someone that for many represents a very own future. For Germans, however, in the German car industry, they want to see someone that is clearly going to stand for what is the backbone of made in Germany cars. I'm sure Matt can agree with this, but Germans are very proud of the cars that they make. Having said that, Francine, when you speak to the auto sector, what they say is that Tesla is still very much a niche car. The price point is also not something that every consumer can buy. So the Germans say we want to compete on that, but make it more affordable and represent the electric vehicle of the future that's made in Germany.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, not a big threat, right? Because globally, Tesla only produces 500,000 cars a year, whereas Volkswagen makes something like 10 million, and then you've got to add that to Daimler and BMW. So German car makers still are doing a lot more in terms of market share. But it is a fascinating story. Maria Tadeo reporting from outside the new Tesla factory, unfinished, as you can see there, to the east of Berlin. Now, tobacco giant Philip Morris may be taking over a maker of asthma drugs. The maker of cigarettes is going to take over a maker of asthma drugs. Vectura's board backed a £1 billion offer, calling it fair and reasonable. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Deirdre Hipwell. So, Deirdre, I guess there are some pretty obvious concerns about this kind of transaction, just in terms of, the maker of a product that destroys your health wants to buy a product that then later fixes it. I mean, is this just completing the circle?
Well, it has certainly occupied many people in the City of London over the last few weeks. It's really become quite a litmus test, really, for a lot of environmental, social and governance concerns and, raised all the time by investors. They say that they take ESG concerns into account, but this is a real live test of whether that is the case, because clearly a lot of health charities, scientific organizations feel that there is a real ethical conflict with big tobacco owning a company whose products are used to treat many of the illnesses caused by cigarettes. And, they fear that scientists working at Vectura will no longer be able to work with other scientific organizations because of that conflict, and even some concerns that doctors will stop prescribing Vectura drugs if they feel it's enriching the tobacco industry.
All right, Deirdre, thank you so much. Deirdre Hipwell of Bloomberg talking about that kind of eyebrow-raising deal. Now, I do want to take a look at some of the stocks moving in pre-market trading here in the U.S. A number of earnings-related movers to the downside, one of them being Airbnb. The big problem for the company is the Delta variant. They say bookings will be down in the third quarter from the same period pre-pandemic in 2019 because of the spread of that variant. That stock is down 4% in early hours. Another stock moving to the downside is Doordash. This has been a pandemic winner. A lot of people at home wanting to get their food delivered to them. But in order to sustain that growth, they're going to have to invest a lot more. And investors don't like the idea of spending more money. That stock is down the better part of 5%. But absolutely plunging to the downside in pre-market trading is Wish or Context Logic. Its second quarter results coming in well under expectations. Management says it missed even their own expectations. They're going to make some changes. But investors punishing that stock this morning. It's down about 19% before the bell, Francine.
Oh, that's rough, Kailey. When you miss your own expectations, it's never a good thing. I love the snapshot of Airbnb and, of course, Doordash. It's basically our pandemic in a snapshot. Coming up, Kamakshya Trivedi, Goldman Sachs Global Co-Head of FX. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacqua in London and Kailey Leinz in New York. Joining us now is Kamakshya Trivedi, co-head of Global Foreign Exchange, Interest Rates and Emerging Markets Strategy Research at Goldman Sachs International. Kamakshya, thanks very much for coming on the program. Let me first get your take on what we see going on in emerging markets, specifically in China with the port closure and the crackdown. How has this, which has really, roiled markets over the last month or two, changed your strategy at Goldman Sachs?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. I really think global markets have been roiled by three fears. I think concern around China, its growth outlook, the Delta variant, I think is a key part of that. I think there's also some concern around the peaking in growth in the US and Europe, so, parts of the developed world that, the fast acceleration pace we have seen there is now sort of past its peak. And then I think there is some residual concern about sort of Fed hawkishness. And ultimately, we think that all of these fears feel somewhat overdone. I think there is, some justifiable reason for each of these concerns. But further down the line, we still see a global economy that is likely to continue growing at a decent pace, if not quite at the pace that we saw at the start of the year. But I think it has affected our market strategy. Yes.
Yeah, so what are you expecting for dollar? What will sustain dollar from here until end of the year?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to come to, which is that I think that, I think as these fears subside, the sequence in which they subside is going to matter for the dollar. And I think that, while, for out to the, end of the year and sort of over a 12-month period, we expect the dollar to still move lower. I think in the near term, for this bout of dollar appreciation to recede, you do need to see some relief on the inflation front in the US on the one hand, and some recovery in market sentiment about global growth on the other. I think until those two things happen, I think it's hard to see the dollar go down too far too fast.
So Kamakshya, what's the relationship between the dollar and treasury yields right now?
Look, I think that there is always a close relation. And as I said, I think one of the concerns that people have is that if, that we are in this sort of delicate position in the markets, if we start relaxing about the global economy, if we start relaxing that, about the Delta variant, then, on the other hand, tapering comes back on the agenda. Then the Fed and Fed hawkishness comes back on the agenda. So I think, the dollar is being supported by sort of these two legs. On the one hand, the concerns about the global economy, which sort of, causes the dollar to strengthen on a kind of risk-off basis or concerns about, global growth. On the other hand, if those concerns somewhat recede, there are concerns of the Fed tapering, and then that might push Treasury yields higher, and that might support the dollar. As I said, ultimately, we think that the global economy will recover and the inflation in the U.S. will come back down again, and so the dollar will be back on the back foot, but that's some while away.
Kamakshya, what will support stronger sterling?
Look, I think there's already been a few indications there. I mean, I think, the NPC has begun to change, already indicated a change in the sequencing. We've to some extent pull forward our own expectations of when the normalization process in policy can begin. And if we are right that the UK is likely to see continued strong recovery into the last quarter of the year, so into the sort of second half of the year, I think we are likely to see sterling continue to strengthen from these levels. We recently strengthened our forecast for euro sterling down to 0.85. I think the sterling is onto a good thing here.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Kamakshya Trivedi there, co-head of Global Foreign Exchange, Interest Rate and Emerging Market Strategy Research at Goldman Sachs International. More markets next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz in New York with Francine Lacqua in London and Matt Miller in Berlin. Now let's get the first word news. And U.S. regulators have authorized giving an extra coronavirus vaccine dose to the most vulnerable people. Americans with weakened immune systems will be allowed to get the third shot. They include organ transplant recipients and patients with conditions like cancer. A divided U.S. Supreme Court has cleared the way for some eviction proceedings to resume in New York. Justices blocked a provision that gave renters a shield if they said they were experiencing hardships because of the pandemic. The court sided with landlords who say they have been devastated by what they contend is an unconstitutional law. The 3 liberal judges dissented. Bloomberg has learned the European soccer organization UEFA is putting the final touches on what could be a $7 billion rescue package. It's designed to help teams in Europe recover from the impact of the pandemic. The rescue also would prevent teams with super rich owners from gaining an unfair advantage by imposing new salary caps. And Credit Suisse is making another attempt to reinforce its management team in the wake of heavy losses. Former UBS executive Axel Lehmann has been nominated to head the board's risk committee. And the former chief risk officer at Lloyd's, Juan Columbus, has been named a seat to the Credit Suisse board. So that saga continues, Matt. Credit Suisse still trying to get its head around risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. Bringing in people from UBS and ING, it's interesting for sure, but the question is, does it solve the problem? And I would imagine they probably have to go much further than that.
Yeah, they probably do. But what we know is that what the chairman so far has promised he'd do, he's done. So I don't know whether it's enough to alleviate concern, but certainly it'll go a little way towards that. And then we need to talk about a lot more. That UEFA story I find incredible because it's literally, it reads like a refinancing prospectus for football. Coming up next, we talk about Afghanistan. The Taliban continuing their rapid advance across Afghanistan. We'll speak with Ibrahim Bahis, Crisis Group Afghanistan consultant, next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Matt, I know we need to talk about the markets, but it is a quite August day. The story that actually caught our attention as well is a private equity firm offering some £3 billion for a pet company. Now, this is, a complete pandemic story just because of the number of pets that people have bought, and people buy organic food for their pets in many countries.
Well, I have been one of those people buying organic food and just really naturally raised meats for Steve for years. My 10-year-old Rottweiler, who is in great condition right now, probably as a result of that. Look, there's a lot of M&A going on today, and I think that reflects what we've seen, the trend that we've seen so far this year and last year. We just continue to grow to new M&A records. We have deals today we talked about already in terms of Philip Morris trying to buy an asthma drug maker. You've got Adidas selling Reebok to Authentic Brands, which I think is really fascinating. And you've got this Hellman & Friedman offer for Zoo Plus. So there's just another $10 billion of deals to talk about today. And it's interesting that we consider that like a slow August Friday now because we're just so immune to these big numbers.
Yeah, equities aren't moving that much. That's why it's slow in our mind. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot going on. And actually, if you look at this pet supplies, for example, 40% premium from yesterday's closing price. So, Kailey, we can't say that there's nothing going on in the markets.
Yeah, that's right. And Matt talks about being immune to big numbers. I feel like we've also gotten immune to record highs because we're at another one in Europe. And we had the 47th record high of the year for the S&P 500 yesterday. And we're all like, yeah, OK, that tracks. In Europe, the stock 600 up just about 0.1% right now. If it does indeed close in the green, we'll be the 10th up day in a row, which I believe is the longest winning streak since all the way back in 1999. Now, after that 47th record high of the year, we'll see if we can make it 48 on the S&P 500. Right now, futures are in positive territory, up around 4 points. We are seeing yields coming lower in the bond market, about 1.5 basis points on the 10-year. It is still set for its second consecutive weekly advance in yields, which is the first time that has happened since March. And crude, meanwhile, down about 0.25%. WTI trading right under $69 a barrel. Of course, there are also a lot of earnings stories and bigger movers going on beneath the surface, one of them being Disney. Two things going on here. One is everybody expected the parks division may actually get hit because of the Delta variant. That did not happen. Plus, streaming was really strong. Disney Plus now has 116 million subscribers, more than analysts anticipated. So that stock is up 5% as a result. But a lot of movers to the downside on earnings as well. One of them being Airbnb, the Delta variant going to weigh on bookings in the current period. It's down 4%. Doordash down 5% because it has to spend a lot more money in order to sustain its growth. And finally, SoFi also plunging about 7.2% to the downside. Student loan demand still really depressed from pre-pandemic levels. So that stock coming up short of expectations, Matt.
You know, every time someone says Doordash, it makes me think of Jordache jeans. And with all the things coming back from the 80s and the 90s, I wouldn't be surprised to see kids rocking those with a fanny pack. Let's talk about some more big numbers right now. In Washington, President Joe Biden's $4.1 trillion economic agenda faces a difficult path through Congress. Emily Wilkins, Bloomberg government reporter, joins us from D.C. right now. And as we know, this won't be easy, mainly because the numbers are too big for a couple of Democratic senators.
Yeah, you see the moderate Democrats, these names aren't going to surprise anyone at this point. Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Kyrsten Sinema, being a little concerned about that $3.5 trillion price tag that's currently there. But one thing to note is that at this point, that's a maximum. This budget resolution that we saw the Senate pass, that we're going to be seeing the House pass a little bit later this month, that's sort of the maximum top line spending amount. So remember, the final reconciliation bill, it hasn't even begun to start being written yet. And so we have a long way to go in terms of negotiations, in terms of what can be in, what can be out, but obviously expecting to see a lot of tensions between the moderate wing of the party that has some concerns about that higher spending and the progressive wing of the party, which really sees this as a kind of once in a very rare time to get actually a large legislative priority done. You talk to Democrats, they say the last time they had something like this was the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And they want to make sure that they're not missing this opportunity to make some what they see as big and necessary changes.
So, Emily, that's what's going on the domestic politics front. In geopolitics, obviously, the U.S. is proceeding with its pullback from Afghanistan. The Taliban is advancing, and the Biden administration is starting to catch a lot of flack for that. Are we likely to see any kind of action from Congress as the situation unfolds?
So you are hearing members of Congress really speak out against the Biden administration's plan to withdraw from Afghanistan. You've really heard this from the start since the plan was announced. You heard similar criticisms when former President Trump announced a pull-out from Afghanistan. Right now, though, it seems like the ball is mostly in President Biden's court as far as what can be done. One thing you did see Congress move on was making sure that there were those special visas for those in Afghanistan who had worked with U.S. troops. Other than that, though, Congress has a really full agenda right now. And in many cases, sort of what the international play, what needs to happen next, a lot of that power does reside with the Biden administration in the executive office. So I think you'll see pressure on Biden from members of Congress as far as what needs to be done going forward in terms of air support, in terms of how many troops need to be there. But as far as Congress actually taking any action, it's not clear at this point if that's something they'll do.
Emily, thank you so much. Emily Wilkins there of Bloomberg Government. Now joining us for more on Afghanistan is Ibrahim Bahis, independent researcher and consultant for Crisis Group. Ibrahim, when you look at I don't know whether you call it a gross miscalculation from the U.S., but did they not realize that the Afghani troops were so badly equipped to deal with advancing Taliban?
Well, let me begin by saying that the changes we're seeing on the ground are completely mind-boggling. Just 10 days ago, the Republican troops had defended Herat city from advancing Taliban fighters. We had the Allahu Akbar campaign in support of the Republic in full swing. And it really looked like the Republic was going to hold it together against the onslaught on provincial capitals. Within the past 10 days, 15 of the 34 provincial capitals in Afghanistan have fallen to the Taliban. Ismail Khan, who led the defense of Herat, has reportedly been captured by the Taliban. They've captured almost the entire north of the country, except for Mazar-e-Sharif and one other province. In the west, Herat city has fallen to the Taliban. In the south, all the provinces in the west have also fallen to the Taliban. In the south, Kandahar, the second largest city and the birthplace of the Taliban, has fallen to them. And just today, the Taliban captured the provincial capital of several provinces that lead to Kabul. Right now, the mood on the ground is...
Is it, Ibrahim, when I look at this, after 20 years of fighting U.S. military forces, the Taliban so easily bounces back and takes control of an entire country. Is it because they simply have the popular support of the people? I mean, how have they remained so powerful?
Well, there's a number of reasons for why they have managed. First of all, I should say, I think the advance of the Taliban has caught almost everyone off guard. This was a completely unexpected, even by the initial estimates of US officials that we see a few months ago. This kind of advance just wasn't envisaged. Why they have advanced so fast, there are a number of reasons, and the reckoning and the retrospection that this will entail is still going on. But what we have noticed is there's a number of factors that are immediate. The way that in a lot of the new areas that the Taliban are capturing, defense security forces are completely abandoning or negotiating local deals with the insurgents. You've seen, but I would say that there have been factors for a long time that have played.
But Ibrahim, do the Afghani people want the Taliban to take power? Do they have the support of the people? I can't imagine that this would be possible without that kind of support.
The insurgents have certainly tried to frame their military advances as an indication of popular support. But as I try to point out, there are always a number of factors that play into a military advance. This is the Republicans, the vast majority of recent victories are the Republican soldiers either abandoning the fight or surrendering.
Yeah.
So it's not really a stiff resistance that's been overcome. It's more local deals happening. And there's a number of factors, just very briefly, the central periphery dynamics, the legitimacy of the Afghan government has been under question for a long time, the precipitous withdrawal of international troops. These are all factors that have played a role in what we are seeing unfold today.
So Ibrahim, speaking of factors, the timing factor, if the Biden administration had delayed this pullout 6 months, a year, would it have made a difference?
There will certainly be people that would argue that that is the case, that this could have happened. But those that have been observing this for a long time generally tend to have a unanimous opinion that the Taliban have been making steady grounds. Since the surge, the Taliban have continued to gain ground year after year, and that the presence of international troops was one big factor why the Taliban were continuing to gain recruitment on the ground and continue, despite the heavy losses they were suffering at the hands of ISAF troops, they were able to replenish and actually continue to gain ground.
Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us. Ibrahim Bahis there, consultant at Crisis Group. Coming up, investing in the electric future. We'll speak with the chairman of the European Sustainable Growth SPAC on their new $580 million deal. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later on today, Mohamed El-Arian, Gramercy Funds Management Chair and Bloomberg Opinion columnist. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacqua in London and Kailey Leinz in New York. Now, earlier this month, President Biden urged automakers to electrify their fleets and reduce emissions.
A future of the automobile industry that is electric, battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, fuel cell electric. It's electric, and there's no turning back.
One company looking to lead in EV infrastructure is ADS Tech Energy. The German company, which builds technology for electric car charging stations, has agreed to merge with the European Sustainable Growth SPAC. Merge is a word I hate, so let's just say sell itself. Lars Thunell, the SPAC's chairman, now joins us. Lars, you purchased this company. There's no such thing as a merger. That's just PR speak. What do you hope to do with it?
Well, I think there is a need for charging stations, especially ultra-fast chargers. That is the technology that this German company, ADS Tech, has developed. You know, we can all have, as long as we live in houses, we can have residential houses. We can have chargers that do it all night. But more and more, we need to do it in 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And that's what really this company is all about. They have a very exciting technology that allows you to use the level of voltage that you have in a normal residential area, and with a buffer, bring it into fast charging.
So,
and that
Lars,
really
what's the biggest
will
challenge?
help everything.
Right. What's the biggest challenge? Is there still a piece of technology that would actually make it cheaper and charge faster that you need to really reach that critical mass?
Well, this company uses a battery system, which allows us to, as I said, to use lower voltage. And that means you don't have to put the money into the infrastructure in new electrical lines. You don't have to build things. You can just put them out there very, very quickly. And this is going to be so important with all the electrical vehicles coming on stream over the next couple of years, both
Lars,
in Europe and the United States.
Yeah, Lars, there may be more EVs and more charging needed, but this is also a market that is getting very saturated with players who want to get into that space. How do you differentiate yourself and compete?
In most people or most companies are actually setting up the chargers themselves. We are the ones selling the technology to them, selling the product so they can actually have ultra-fast chargers. And that could be to cities, it could be to these charging companies, it could be to anybody who wants to put up a charger outside a shopping center. So this is really fulfilling that niche, and it's a unique product that we have developed. So I think it's very, very exciting.
How long until, Lars, electric chargers, quick electric chargers, are as ubiquitous as gas stations here in Europe?
Well, I think it's going to take a number of years, but we're already working, for example, with Porsche and with their new electrical car, and that will allow you to charge very quickly. So I think it will be a gradual thing, but with Biden's package now, and you have a similar package in Europe, it's going to be very, very, very fast.
Hopefully. I mean, he's also pushing for OPEC to pump as much as they can because he wants gas to be cheaper. That's not going to help your advancement. And the other thing I've noticed in my experimentation with electric cars is that it's often difficult to make these charging stations work. There's so many different systems. Getting them to turn on and figuring out how to pay is not as intuitive as it is at a gas station. What's the solution for that?
Well, I think at least in Europe, there is a number of consortia that are working on standardization now of these charging chargers. There are efforts to create joint ventures. Tesla is even talking about opening up their charging stations for everybody because they realize there are going to be more of others than theirs at some point going forward.
But Lars, we've also seen quite a lot of research saying that EV charging stations can be a conduit for cyber attacks or theft of ID, and actually could eventually jeopardize, if done in the right way for the thieves, jeopardize the security of the power grid. So how aware of you of that, and how much are you spending to try and fix that?
We are not fixing that. I think that's up to the utilities and the governments to sort out the security of the electrical systems in every single country. And I'm sure they're already working on that.
Yeah, Lars, for sure. We hope they are. Lars Thunell, chairman of the European Sustainable Growth SPAC, talking to us about his acquisition. And, I think this is one of the keystones of the shift to electric. I mean, we need, obviously, the charging infrastructure up and ready to use in order to shift over to electric cars. Later on today, more on the future of autos with someone who's making a naturally aspirated 6.5-liter V12 engine. Lamborghini CEO Stephen Winkleman joins us to talk about the new Countach, 50 years after the first iconic supercar. That's at 3 p.m. in New York, 8 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Tom Keene, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance also joins us. Tom, I was actually looking at some of the luxury spending around the world, which is giving a nice little lift to the CAC 40. You're looking at another kind of retailer.
Well, another like in a retailer. I thought instead of getting the economics of the moment in inflation, all the other stories that are out there, and including Francine, as you know, international relations front and center, how about a stock and how this actually occurs in a great bull market? Joe Feldman over at Telsey Advisory Group is #1 on target, and it's real simple. He's been out front, and the way you get to a 66% return per year, Francine, coming off the ugliness of late 2018, is you have a price target, and then a year later, you have another price target, and a year later, you have another price target, and he raised his price target this morning up nicely above where target is. The point is, Francine, this is the real world of how you buy and hold a stock in a bull market. We forget that.
Yeah, Tom, Target, of course, reporting earnings next week. We also got Disney after the bell yesterday. Are you surprised by the fact that the Delta variant doesn't seem to be affecting the parks business really at all?
I think it's minutia. Yeah, I take real issue with this. These are multi-sector businesses. Yeah, they got serious issues with the parks. There's a streaming bet where I think they did better than good and seem to be #2 to Netflix. But what I would say about Disney is the courage to go all in. And it's rare that you see that in the big visible corporate world. They went all in on streaming, Kailey.
Tom, I'm looking forward to the show. Tom Keene there, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance. Now, let's see what else we're watching today. And I know, Kailey, you're actually looking at the favorite indicator of Janet Yellen.
Yeah, UMich consumer sentiment coming out at 10 a.m. Eastern time. I will be breaking it down with Guy Johnson on Bloomberg Markets, and we'll actually be talking to the director of research for University of Michigan surveys. It'll be interesting to see what kind of impact, if any, the Delta variant is having on sentiment this month. And of course, especially in light of this week's CPI and PPI prints, the inflation expectations gauges could be really interesting. How consumers are viewing price pressures over the next year, over the next 5 to 10 year horizon. And then also, because it is her favorite indicator, I would like to say happy birthday to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. She turned 75 today, Matt.
Happy birthday.
I wonder, happy birthday for sure to Janet Yellen. I wonder when you talk to that UMich exec if the interview will come straight out of Ann Arbor. Is it legit, University of Michigan?
Yeah.
Is this a Wolverine that you're talking to?
Yeah, he
all right,
works
well,
for
I
the
won't
university.
watch that.
Yeah, tune in.
All right, go Buckeyes. I'm going to be watching Lamborghini as supercar maker unveils a new Countach, which I think is amazing. This is the first really iconic supercar. You're looking at the old one from the 1970s. By the way, you may know this, Francine. Apparently the name, normally Lamborghini names all their cars after famous Spanish bulls, but this name comes from
like
a Bolognese colloquialism that means something to the effect of OMG. Apparently an old farmer on a tractor saw the Countach testing in Santa Agata and said, Countach, which means like, oh my God.
Which really is the only thing you can say when you see such a beautiful car. So this is the old one. And then, I mean, what's the new one going to look like?
The new one, I hope, looks very similar, but I also hope that it drives a lot better because by all reports, the original Countach, although it looked amazing, probably rolling through Miami Beach, was a real bear to drive. You certainly couldn't see out the rear window to back up, and probably also the performance was a little bit weak. Yeah.
I love that. Every time Kailey does a superb market check, as always, I'm going to say Countach. Elon Musk, also in Germany. Countach.
Yeah, Elon Musk is here. As you just saw, we got live pictures there of Elon Musk walking around his new factory. I might drive out there right now. I might pop out and see Maria Tadeo.
And come back with Countach. I'm watching at all the potential disruption because of what's happening, of course, at that third biggest port in the world in China that's been almost closed off. This is Bloomberg. Have a great weekend, everyone.